Serbia. The United States government and the Western media unanimously agrees that in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the US government built up an opposition movement inside Serbia and overthrew the government there. It was not an organic protest. It was engineered from top to bottom, completely funded and directed by the US government through the National Endowment for Democracy and adjacent private and public foundations, including George Soros's Open Society. And again, this takes place regardless of whether there's a Republican or Democrat president in the White House. And it is continuing even to this day, even with President Trump and his administration claiming to have defunded and dismantled USAID, the NED, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. I will show you that all of their websites are all online. They're still in operation. They're still funding regime change all around the globe, with the exception of USAID. That has been dismantled in terms of a separate structure, has been integrated under the State Department, now functions as part of the State Department. Again, that's according to the State Department itself. How do we know that the US government overthrew the government of Serbia at the turn of the 21st century? Well, the New York Times told us they did, and they cited people in the National Endowment for Democracy who admitted what they did in Serbia. Who really brought down Milosevic? This was published in November 2000. This is the New York Times. I'm going to read to you from this article from 25 years ago. This is what it says in the article, and then listen to how contradictory even this article is, and the requirement for critical thinking when reading Western media, because if you don't use critical thinking, they will tell you the truth. They will tell you that the US overthrew the government, but at the same time, they will convince you that it was an organic, grassroots uprising. The author of this New York Times article begins by saying, "I have traveled southward from Belgrade over bridges now repaired after NATO's 1999 bombing." Because remember, they tried to violently just bomb Serbia, and the US, through NATO and through its political capture of Europe, dismembered Yugoslavia, split it into all of these Balkanized. The word Balkanized comes from what the US and NATO did to the Balkans. Because it was not the capital that toppled Milosevic. For all the stirring images of the federal parliament in flames, okay, so we're always told that was a peaceful color revolution. All of these are always violent, and the Western media just selectively chooses not to report on the violence or emphasize the violence. Rather, his overthrow came through a provincial uprising stirred in large measure by Serbian youth acting through a grassroots movement called OPAR, which means resistance. And this is what people are insisting today. The protests in Serbia, and I will talk about Indonesia as well, the violent protests taking place there, identical protests taking place there, again, on the other side of the planet, but identical in nature. They say that these violent mobs in the streets burning their own country to the ground over things that don't justify burning your own country to the ground. They're claiming that this is a grassroots movement, that the US isn't involved in any shape, form, or way. But I'm going to prove to you that all of the groups that you can identify involved in the protests are literally funded by the US government or an adjacent private or European government-funded foundation. So that's what the New York Times says. They say these were grassroots youth-led movements. I remember being a youth. I was not capable of overthrowing a government. That is a fact. But I was capable of being influenced very easily by people with lots of money, marketing muscle, to the point where I literally joined the US Marines and I voted for George Bush Jr. It was the first and only time I ever voted in a US presidential election. And then I grew up and woke up. But that's how powerful marketing was. Political marketing, corporate marketing, it takes holds of people, and the youth especially are impressionable. That's what makes them youth. That's what I remember as being a youth, how impressionable I was, and how the process of becoming an adult is in part overcoming that impressionability, or at least picking and choosing what you allow to make an impression upon you. So then the New York Times admits, this is what they also admit in the exact same article where they labeled this grassroots. They said, American assistance to UPAR And the 18 parties that ultimately ousted Milosevic is still a highly sensitive subject because it was secret. They always do this covertly. And they're aware that if their involvement is uncovered, it will undermine the whole effort. So they will do anything required, including pretending to be anti-American, to try to push all of this through. And that is exactly what they're doing all around the globe, even to this day. It's not ended. But Paul B. McCarthy, an official with the Washington-based, and I will add US government-funded, National Endowment for Democracy, or NED, is ready to divulge some details. So the New York Times interviewed someone from the NED, and he admits that they funded absolutely everything. They did it secretly, and they will explain how. McCarthy says from August 1999, so again, in advance, years in advance, they begin preparing all of this. The dollars started to flow to par pretty significantly. Of the almost $3 million spent by his group in Serbia since September 1998. So again, years, this is spanning years to prepare for this. These are not spontaneous. I always hear people say it's spontaneous. The Arab Spring was spontaneous and the US simply hijacked it. No, they didn't. They engineered it years in advance. All of the groups leading the Arab Spring crossed the entirety of the Arab world. Everywhere it erupted, the protest leaders leading it were all in the United States and Europe and Latin America, US State Department funded workshops being funded, equipped, and trained to go back to the respective countries and burn them to the ground. We see the result of all of that. The money went into Optar accounts outside Serbia to conceal the fact that the US government was funding this grassroots youth movement. It was a US government movement, and they were using the youths as impressionable cover. At the same time, McCarthy had a series of meetings with the movement's leaders. And then they list all of these capitals outside of Serbia where they met these leaders. They met with them outside of Serbia. Secret meetings, secret funding. And then these people passed themselves off as spontaneous, organic, grassroots-driven protest leaders, when in reality they were created, funded, and directed by the US through secret money channeled to them and secret meetings where they were told what to do. Homan, at 28, one of Optar's senior members, was one of McCarthy's interlocutors. We had a lot of financial help from Western non-governmental organizations, Homan says, and we also some Western governmental organizations that, of course, they call the NED an NGO, but it isn't. It is created by the US government, is funded by the US government, and it is overseen by the US government. So no matter how badly they want to pass it off as an NGO, a non-governmental organization, it is a US government organization. Let us continue. So, of course, the takeaway here is they meet with these people, they fund them secretly. It's very hard to trace it when it's happening. And they go through extensive measures to conceal their involvement, okay? But I will show you how to find the fingerprints of US government intervention, because there are certain groups that they have to fund that are very public, and it's very difficult to conceal funding for them, although they're working on fixing that, and I'll explain how in just a moment. So I've had people arguing with me that President Alexander Vučić of Serbia, he's horrible, he's pro-US, he's pro-NATO, he's pro-EU, and you can prove it because I read an op-ed in The Guardian, and that proves that the West, I read one op-ed in the Western media, and that proves that the West is behind President Vučić. And this is the one that they show me. Serbia cannot accept violent street protests, and their takeaway by just reading the headline, not even looking at who wrote it, and they're saying, this is proof that the West is against the violent protests, and that's how we know these are legit grassroots protests. There are no grassroots protests. There's not a single, for good or bad, there are no grassroots protests. Every single protest, good or bad, requires leadership and resources to sustain for any length of time and in any hope to achieve anything. Protests in and of themselves do not achieve anything. You need to have a circle of interest capable of exploiting whatever leverage you create with the protests themselves, which requires leadership and resources. I am in Thailand, in Southeast Asia. I have witnessed US government-funded protests here in Thailand and protests funded by Thai interests, powerful Thai interests here in Thailand, opposed to US interference inside Thailand's internal political affairs. I've seen both, and they both require huge amounts of resources and very good leadership. So this article is actually by President Alexander Vučić himself. It's a letter that The Guardian published that he wrote. And if you actually read it past the headline, it says Serbia's deep engagement with Europe is hardly consistent with the idea of it as an authoritarian and malign outliner in the region. And then they admit that this is the president writing this letter. And then what is he writing this letter in response to? An editorial in The Guardian. This is how the Western media actually feels about the protests in Serbia. They link directly to it. In that that's not even an op-ed, the letter to The Guardian, it says, The Guardian view on protests in Serbia, a battle for democracy that the EU must not ignore. So that they're actually literally supporting the protests. And the president of Serbia is writing a letter to The Guardian saying, you're wrong. You're wrong about everything you wrote in that article where you're supporting these violent protesters. So anyone waving one single article around that they cherry-picked, and they didn't even bother reading it and seeing what it was in response to, and it's not to pick on these people, but this is how ordinary people decipher the unfolding geopolitical landscape. It is through a series of emotional reactions. They're not engaging their critical thinking. They're not being objective. They're being emotional, and they're simply reacting to it. If you applied critical thinking, you remained objective, and you actually analyzed what you were looking at, you would have seen that that letter to The Guardian was in response to what The Guardian's actual view of the protests were. And I'm going to read from this Guardian op-ed where they explain what the Guardian's position and, of course, the wider Western media and, of course, the corporate interests that drive the messaging and narratives of the Western media. I will read it to you so you can see. So this is what the Guardian's actual stance is on the protests. The catalyst for some of the largest demonstrations in Serbia's history since the last time the U.S. overthrew the Serbian government was the collapse of a newly renovated railway station roof in the country's second city, Novi Sad. And I could be saying that wrong, and I apologize if I am. Leading to the deaths of 16 people. The disaster was widely attributed to entrenched fraud and corruption presided over by Mr. Vučić's ruling Serbian Progressive Party, and swiftly became the spark for a movement for democratic reform. Well, there is no such thing as Western-style democracy. It is actually a system of control masquerading as self-determination. So we know that whole concept of this sparking a movement for democratic reform is a complete lie. The students, okay, again, students who haven't even finished school and are not even actually contributing to society, somehow they know better than everybody else, including the government. They're demanding early elections, so essentially regime change, elections that the US and EU can influence, and then from the elections get the results they want, and a new era of transparency and accountability, just like in the rest of the EU, right? In what remains an EU candidate country, as anger and frustration in the streets has mounted, Mr. Vučić's response has become increasingly draconian, groundlessly claiming that foreign agitators were seeking an imported revolution. How is that groundless? The US literally admits they've already done this in Serbia once. And there is a list a mile long, and I'm going to read it to you, of all of the interference the US government is still funding right now under the Trump administration in Serbia specifically. I will show you in just a moment, and I will show you the individual groups that are receiving at least part of that money. So it says, groundlessly claiming that foreign agitators were seeking an imported revolution, and it's in quotation marks for some reason, the president launched a ruthless crackdown on civil society groups in receipt of foreign funds. Well, they're admitting that they're literally, civil society is getting foreign funds, and they're being cracked down on, and they're saying that's groundless, that there are foreign-funded organizations involved in the protests. So they're contradicting themselves in the same sentence, literally. On the streets, orchestrated mobs this month attacked protesters and reportedly looted businesses owned by opponents of Mr. Vučić. There have been widespread reports of police brutality. Well, they admit that the protests themselves are violent. And so the police are responding with force. You have to. If people are burning the country to the ground, the police are required, as their duty, to stop people from burning the country to the ground. And if they can't, the military must. Amid the spiral of violence, one recent anti-government demonstration in Belgrade took place under the slogan, "Let's show them we're not punching bags." In other words, we're going to use violence too, or we're going to use more violence. They said that it's groundless to claim that foreign interests are involved in interfering in Serbia's internal political affairs. I'm going to show you now the list of any of the organizations the US is funding specifically targeting Serbia. And you tell me, if Russia or China were funding programs like this inside the United States, whether the US would tolerate it or not. And if the answer is no, then we know that the US is willingly, knowingly doing something it understands is utterly unacceptable. It would not accept anyone doing it to them, and yet they are doing it to someone else. And they're doing it under a presidential administration that claimed that all of this would end, and yet it continues right before our very eyes. And I've heard people try to excuse the Trump administration by claiming the EU is somehow doing this all on their own. No, the NED's website is still up. I'm going to show it to you right now. I'm going to hit the refresh button so you can see that this isn't archived. It is ned.org, and this is their current website. It is still up. It is still active. They're still actively publishing new articles. We could just click on this one, and we can see this is August 1st, 2025, months after everyone declared President Trump having defunded and dismantled these organizations. It is still online and operating. The whole point of President Trump pretending to dismantle and defund these organizations was to sweep it under the carpet so nobody talked about it. So in their minds, they believed that it was gone, so that when all of this regime change continued, people would then start making excuses and blaming it on Europe, which is called plausible deniability. It's not actually not being responsible. It is creating the illusion that you're no longer responsible. So that is the NED's website. And here is the current disclosure of US government funding through the National Endowment for Democracy in Europe specifically. And of course, it's 46 pages long, and it lists every country, including nations like Belarus. The US policy papers openly admit that they're trying to overthrow countries like Belarus, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Let's continue. Kosovo. And you can see these are long lists. Moldova, that's on the check. The RAND Corporation 2019 paper extending Russia, that's on the checklist. Moldova and Belarus, they're both on the checklist. Let's continue. We'll find Serbia. Here's Serbia. I'm just going to scroll through this slowly, and I'm going to read off some of these. Promoting civic oversight of the security sector, fostering youth engagement, and they're naming regions. These are different regions. They also talk about Kosovo and inter-religious and ethnic, and it's all about creating an identity for all of these different groups within a particular country or region, creating independent identities for them so that they're opposed to one another. This imperial divide and conquer 101, that's what they're doing. They're creating individual identities for people within a country or region, making them feel as if they're special, they're different, they're apart from everyone else. They should act independently, they should pursue independence. And then what the US does is essentially sponsor separatism. And they carve up countries just like the Roman Empire did and the British Empire after that, and as America has done ever since. Promoting professional digital journalism. That's essentially just indoctrinating people across journalism to report the way the US wants them to. Promoting accountability and civic participation in local decision making. So that these are all of the functions of self-determination, of national sovereignty, and the United States is interfering in absolutely all of them. Civic engagement in local communities. Why does the United States government get a say in that? Isn't that the business of the local communities themselves? Strengthening independent local media. This is something KJ No talks about all the time. The lexicon of modern American empire. When they say independent media, they're actually talking about US government-funded propaganda. And that is how we figure out whether a protest is US government funded or not. The US government funded independent media, which is obviously not independent, it's dependent on Washington and annual funding from Washington. And of course, all the secret meetings they obviously engage in, as the New York Times admitted to. They will be on one side or the other of a protest very vocally, because shaping the narrative and getting people on board with either promoting a protest or stopping a protest, that is how the US controls its own color revolutions and manages attempts to push back or reverse previous color revolutions. Let's continue. Strengthening independent local media, fostering public debate and independent reporting. Again, all of these claims of independence, when the whole process of funding them completely undermines the concept of independence. Strengthening civic participation in Eastern Serbia. So again, carving up Serbia. Challenging a culture of impunity for past atrocities is extremely ironic coming from the US government. Fostering youth civic engagement in promoting tolerance. And actually you will see a lot of youth engagement, civic engagement among youth. And that's where you get these youth and student protests, because they have programs specifically creating legions of young people indoctrinated by NED-funded programs in their schools, in their communities, online, through the media. And they build these armies of youths and students, and they're the ones that then go out into the street because they're impressionable. And we all remember what it's like being young and impressionable. And they're the ones that go out and they have all the energy and imprudence to burn their country down, thinking that somehow it will end in some sort of Hollywood movie style happy conclusion where the clouds break and they see the sun and they enter into a new utopian future of peace, freedom, and democracy. Well, it doesn't work out that way. Ask everyone involved in the Arab Spring. Ask Ukraine. Ask Georgia. Ask Myanmar. You see how long the list is. I'm actually not done scrolling through the list. It continues for several pages. And then they get to Ukraine. So they're still meddling in Ukraine, because it's not about just capturing a country. It's about maintaining control over the country after that. The US creates these parallel institutions, uses color revolutions to install them over the indigenous institutions of a targeted country, and then builds them up after that to make it harder and harder to reverse once they sink their hooks in. So an extensive current program of funding sedition inside Serbia. That is what all of that is. If Russia or China were funding that inside the US, it would be labeled sedition. It would be ended in a heartbeat. And yet the United States is doing this, and they're doing it very quietly. And the Trump administration itself specifically has convinced millions of Trump supporters that this isn't even taking place anymore, because he ended it, even though you can find the website online, active, and still operating. Now, you will notice that I read through that extensive list. We didn't see the name of one single organization or political party mentioned. Why is that? And I've mentioned this before. It's because of the new, announced in April 25th, 2025, again, months after the Trump administration came into power, NED's duty of care and public disclosure policies. And what they're claiming is that if people know who these groups are that they're funding, they will get in trouble. Which is obvious. I mean, they're funded by the US to carry out sedition and treason, to burn their country down, to divide it and destroy it. And of course, if people knew who these groups were and that they were being funded by the US, and that's why they were burning everything down, literally killing people in the streets, they might take issue with that. It might make it harder for the US to succeed in regime change. So what they're saying is the NED was created to transparently do what the CIA had previously done, regime change all around the world. But this transparency has kind of boomeranged back at them. And so now they are going covert again. And it's kind of the best of both worlds, because the NED still doesn't sound as bad as a CIA-sponsored uprising. But now the NED isn't being transparent at all. And you have to really, really dig to find evidence of which groups specifically are being funded. But if you know how to research properly, you will find entire lists of at least media organizations, and sometimes legal and fake human rights organizations funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. And you look and see, either on their website, if it doesn't say on their website, their X or other social media platform, they will be keeping up with current events, and you will see what their position is on any development within a specific country, or even around the world for that matter. And so let's go over a list of organizations. This is called the Center for Investigative Journalism of Serbia. It says it is, if you look on their website, it says that it is a member, and of course they have all of these lists of awards that they've been given by the United States, European Union, and all the government and corporate funded foundations that the US uses to pursue primacy all around the globe, including through US sponsored regime change. So this is already extremely obvious. But it admits all of these organizations that it is a part of, including the Global Investigative Journalism Network. Okay, so then you go to that and you see, if they're not going to admit who funds them there, you go to the organizations that they belong to. If it's an umbrella organization, it's possible the money is being laundered through them to the subsidiary, thus, again, laundering money and support is done specifically to conceal the source of the funding. So if you go to Global Investigative Journalism Network, which this Center for Investigative Journalism of Serbia is a part of, they admit that they're funded by Open Society, all of these other corporate, private foundations that work parallel to the National Endowment for Democracy. And it says, we are grateful for generous core support from founders such as Oak Foundation, the Open Society Foundations, Humanity United, the Reva and David Logan Foundation, the Luminate Group, Hug Morenz Foundation for Media Literacy, the Cottonwood Spring Foundation, and the Bay and Paul Foundations. And if you look all of them up, you will see how the tentacles all spread all across the US and European government. They're private and public fronts that they use to fund sedition all around the world. Now, getting back to the original Center for Investigative Journalism of Serbia, CINS. Look at some of the articles that they have published over the years. Party Funds Database, SNS. This is the party of current president of Serbia, Alexander Vučić, the financially strongest political party in Serbia. If you read through this, they make it sound like they're so shady and abusive and they've got all of this money and it's lopsidedly shifting power in their favor. It's unfair. Something should be done about this. So it instantly tells you a flag should go up and say, these are US, European funded media outfits targeting and undermining the current government. Why would they do that? If that was their client regime of choice, why would they be doing that? There's also, again, another organization connected to Serbia involved in promoting the protests and targeting the current government and trying to undermine it. And that is the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network. And they're very straightforward about who funds them. The European Commission, the British Embassy in Belgrade, Open Society right there, even though they kind of, you gotta kind of squint, you can see it says Open Society Foundation, Serbia. Freedom House, which is a subsidiary of the NED. The NED itself, USAID is still listed there, even though it's been integrated into the State Department and this branding has been dispensed of. Transparency International, which again is just funded by this collection. It's a self-sustaining cycle where they're all funding each other. An Open Society funds Transparency International. That will fund a bunch of organizations co-funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. And you could spend all day, all week, all month digging into all of this. And you will see how extensive it is. And when you hear people say, Brian, you think the US is involved everywhere? Well, they literally are, and the evidence is there, and you could spend a lifetime documenting it and mapping it out. So those are the donors for BIRN, or BIRN if you want to call it that. And they have a list of partners that fall under them. And it's all of these, there's a variety of organizations here, but there are specific ones that are media organizations. KRIK, KRIK, DONUS. And if you go to their websites, and all you do is your browser probably has a translate to English function, just translate it and see what they're complaining about. And if they're sitting there supporting the protests and they're condemning Russia and they're promoting the protests and they're anti the current government, then you can safely conclude that that is the US government stance. Why would they be funding media organizations attacking a government that they themselves want to keep in power? That is how the color revolutions work. They have media, legal organizations, fake human rights groups that cover up the violence. They refuse to report on the violence of the protesters themselves, and they only report on the responses by the police and military. These are all the pieces that fall into place to make up a US engineered color revolution. This is literally what they've done to Serbia once already, and this is what they are doing again. And they're using the exact same method, albeit a little bit differently, but not much differently. And these are these specific, and I'm naming names and I'm showing you where their funding is coming from. These are the organizations that are involved promoting it. What about US government funded propaganda? Indisputably US government funded propaganda, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which everyone thinks President Trump defunded and dismantled. This is from September 1st, 2025, yesterday. Back to school in Serbia, universities seek to break student boycott. And it's all about the heroic youths and students and how heroic they are, protesting the government, demanding change, demanding regime change. And so is very conclusive where the US government stands. You have the Guardian article clearly supporting the protests. They published the president's letter in response to what their official stance was on the protests, which was supporting them. Literally US government funded media, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. They support the protests, and all the NED Open Society funded media organizations in Serbia themselves support the protests. And another trick that you can use is you go to some of their websites. They don't update often. They have a heavy presence on social media. What you do is you look for, let's just type in KRIK. Here we go. Let's see what they say about the protests. Let's see if they're for or against the protests. And you can see they cross-post all of the groups listed on this list. You will see them cross-post. This is what the NED organizations do in Thailand, where I'm based. They all cross-post each other. It's all a self-referring network of US government-funded propaganda. And so Nuns is on there. If you look, they're on there, right here. Okay? That's how it all works. This is how it works everywhere. It's one playbook, every country. And this media organization in particular, they were the ones covering and digging into and investigating all the corruption surrounding the railway roof collapse that was used. And I'm not saying that's not a legitimate reason to be upset, but that they used that as cover to then push the color revolution forward. That's how they always do it. They do not hijack legitimate protests. They build illegitimate protests around legitimate issues. People are not just going to spontaneously come out and start burning their whole country down because a railway station collapsed. What sense does that even make? It doesn't make any sense. A railway station collapses, you're going to go out, burn things down, and get more people killed in response to it. What do you think you're going to achieve by doing that, especially looking at just Serbia's own recent history alone? What does that serve? Nothing. Serves nothing. Okay, so pinned at the very top of their profile is again, a story attacking Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić. It's about all of the corruption that they are using as a catalyst to get these protests going. And then they're going to use violence and the resulting casualties, injuries, and deaths to escalate it, just like they did in Ukraine, just like they did all across the Arab Spring. Again, all premeditated years in advance. These were not spontaneous protests the US swooped in and hijacked. Now, there are people, again, there are people who swear that President Aleksandar Vučić is a US puppet, pro-EU, pro-NATO. And these are people who are dissatisfied by the compromise and the game that he has been playing to try to balance Serbia between a desire to maintain its relationship with Russia and the rest of the world, and the fact that it's completely surrounded by the Western world. And people don't understand that. Ordinary people don't understand that. They're extremely emotional. Many of them have a tendency towards a more extreme set of options that they haven't really thought through at all. These are the same people that claim Russian President Vladimir Putin is a traitor because he hasn't fired nuclear missiles at London and Washington over the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. These are people that don't think one or two steps ahead of whatever it is that pops into their brain. And I'm not saying that they're bad people, but they're just people that haven't given serious thought to these issues. They're reacting emotionally, just like the people who are getting sucked into these protests through US government-sponsored propaganda. The networks that I was just showing to you, mapping out